In 1945, May 15th, President Harry Truman occupied the Oval Office, examining personnel records. He held a document containing 17 names. These individuals had served as Franklin Roosevelt's closest collaborators, some for more than 10 years, top advisors, cabinet officials, and White House personnel. Truman took a pen and inscribed a single word at the top of the page: gone. Before 90 days had passed, every person listed would depart from the White House, dismissed, transferred, or compelled to resign. This marked the most ruthless staff cleansing in presidential history. Truman remained indifferent to who knew about it or their opinions. The removals commenced with Henry Wallace. Roosevelt's previous vice president and current Commerce Secretary became the first target, though Truman waited over a year before taking action in September 1946. However, the strategizing started immediately. Wallace embodied everything Truman mistrusted about Roosevelt's inner circle. He was idealistic to the point of foolishness regarding Soviet ambitions. His allegiance lay with Roosevelt's legacy rather than the new president, and he persistently undermined Truman's authority by suggesting what Roosevelt would have done. Wallace's departure was inevitable, merely a question of timing. Yet Wallace wasn't the only one. Within Truman's initial 3 months as president, the departures were remarkable. Frances Perkins, Roosevelt's labor secretary and America's first female cabinet member, stepped down in June. She was effectively compelled to leave. Truman signaled his desire for his own labor secretary. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Treasury Secretary since 1934, and among Roosevelt's dearest friends, was forced out in July. Truman accepted his resignation with thinly veiled satisfaction. Francis Biddle, the Attorney General, was summarily dismissed in June and replaced with Tom Clark, a Truman loyalist. What motivated this purge? The stated rationale was Truman's wish to assemble his own team, individuals loyal to him rather than his predecessor's memory. This explanation contained partial truth, but the actual motivations were more complex and personal. Truman dismissed everyone close to Roosevelt because he distrusted them. He resented them, believing they had participated in Roosevelt's deliberate exclusion and humiliation of him. This wasn't merely about forming a new administration. This was retribution. The extent of Truman's bitterness became evident in a late April 1945 conversation with his military aide, Harry Vaughan. Vaughan later documented this exchange in his oral history. Truman confided, "These Roosevelt associates all regard me as some unsophisticated Missourian who accidentally stumbled into this position. They don't respect me. They don't trust me. And frankly, I don't trust them either. Every single one of them knew Roosevelt was dying. Every single one knew I was being deliberately kept uninformed. And not one possessed the integrity or courage to inform me of the situation. So why should I retain them?" Truman's suspicions about Roosevelt's staff extended beyond their failure to prepare him for the presidency. He believed many were actively working to undermine him and preserve Roosevelt's policies regardless of the new president's wishes. And he had proof. Shortly after assuming office, Truman discovered that several Roosevelt holdovers were holding private meetings to discuss how to manipulate the new president, how to prevent what they considered missteps, and how to ensure Roosevelt's post-war vision remained intact. These meetings came to Truman's attention through J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director. Hoover, concerned about maintaining his position under the new administration, provided Truman with intelligence reports about the activities of various Roosevelt loyalists. The reports revealed that some White House personnel were sharing information with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was positioning herself as the guardian of FDR's legacy. Others were leaking to sympathetic journalists to create public pressure on Truman to maintain Roosevelt's policies. Some were even discussing potential constitutional grounds to declare Truman incompetent and remove him from office. When Truman reviewed these reports, his rage was explosive. He summoned his appointment secretary, Matthew Connolly, and instructed, "I want a complete roster of everyone in Roosevelt's inner circle, everyone who had his confidence, everyone who met with him regularly. I need to know precisely who these individuals are, and I want them removed. I don't care how long they've served or how significant they believe themselves to be. They're finished." The purge was conducted without subtlety. Truman established that loyalty to him required disloyalty to Roosevelt's memory, at least in practice. Staff members who frequently invoked what Roosevelt would have done found themselves transferred to remote locations or simply dismissed. Individuals who questioned Truman's decisions by unfavorably comparing them to Roosevelt's methods were told bluntly, "President Roosevelt is deceased. I am the president now. If you cannot accept this, there's the exit." Among the most dramatic dismissals was Admiral William Leahy, who had served as Roosevelt's chief of staff and closest military advisor. Leahy had effectively managed White House military operations for years. He was experienced, knowledgeable, and entirely devoted to Roosevelt's legacy. Truman initially retained him because he needed Leahy's expertise during the final months of the war with Japan. But once Japan surrendered in August 1945, Truman began sidelining Leahy, excluding him from crucial meetings and making decisions without consultation. By early 1946, Leahy had been effectively stripped of authority, though he technically remained on staff until 1949. Leahy wrote bitterly in his diary, "President Truman has demonstrated he does not want counsel from anyone associated with President Roosevelt. He apparently views us all as impediments rather than resources. This represents a grave error, but it is his to make." Leahy's removal sent a clear message to others. Association with Roosevelt had become a liability, not an asset. Truman's purge extended beyond cabinet members and senior staff. He systematically removed career civil servants who had been close to Roosevelt. Edward Stettintinius Jr., who had served as Roosevelt's Secretary of State during his final months, was replaced within months by James Burns, a Truman ally. Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's most trusted personal advisor, was immediately marginalized and resigned due to illness in July 1945. Sam Roseman, Roosevelt's speechwriter and counsel, resigned in February 1946 after Truman indicated his services were no longer required. The swiftness and comprehensiveness of the purge shocked Washington. This wasn't a typical administrative transition. This was a hostile takeover of the executive branch by a president who viewed his predecessor's entire operation as a threat. Newspapers began reporting on Truman's purge and the Roosevelt exiles. Some criticized Truman for discarding experienced personnel out of petty resentment. Others understood that Truman was establishing his authority and couldn't achieve this with Roosevelt's ghost influencing every corner of the White House. But there was another motivation for the purge that Truman rarely discussed publicly. He had discovered that some Roosevelt staffers had been actively deceiving him. During his first weeks as president, Truman had questioned various Roosevelt holdovers about decisions that had been made, agreements that had been reached, and promises that had been given. In multiple instances, he later discovered that he had been given misleading or completely false information. Roosevelt's staff had been protecting their former boss's reputation by sanitizing the truth, and Truman couldn't trust anything they told him. The most egregious example concerned the Yalta agreements with Stalin. When Truman asked Charles Bolin, a State Department Soviet expert who had been at Yalta, to explain what Roosevelt had agreed to, Bolin provided a sanitized version that minimized how much Roosevelt had conceded to Soviet demands. Truman later obtained the actual transcripts and notes from Yalta and realized Bolin had been dishonest. Roosevelt had made far more extensive commitments to Soviet control of Eastern Europe than Bolin had acknowledged. Truman never forgave this deception. Bolin remained in government but was never trusted by Truman again. Similarly, when Truman inquired about Roosevelt's health and when people had known he was dying, he received evasive responses. No one wanted to admit they had watched Roosevelt deteriorate for months without preparing his successor. No one wanted to acknowledge their complicity in keeping Truman uninformed. So they lied, minimized, or simply refused to answer directly. This pattern of dishonesty convinced Truman that he couldn't trust anyone who had been close to Roosevelt. They were loyal to a dead man's reputation, not to the living president or to the truth. The purge had a devastating impact on institutional knowledge. Roosevelt had been president for over 12 years. Many of the people Truman dismissed possessed deep expertise in their areas, knowledge of relationships, agreements, and informal understandings that existed nowhere in writing. By removing them so quickly, Truman lost access to that institutional memory. He had to learn things the hard way that experienced Roosevelt staff could have told him immediately. But Truman considered this an acceptable cost. He preferred struggling with inexperienced but loyal staff rather than relying on experienced staff who undermined him. One particularly bitter episode involved Eleanor Roosevelt herself. While not a government employee, Eleanor had been deeply involved in policy discussions during FDR's presidency. She continued attempting to influence policy after his death, offering advice to Truman and advocating for various causes. Initially, Truman was polite and respectful, but as Eleanor continued to invoke her husband's views and imply that Truman was betraying Roosevelt's vision, Truman's patience wore thin. In October 1945, Eleanor sent Truman a lengthy letter criticizing his handling of labor disputes and suggesting he wasn't honoring Roosevelt's commitment to workers' rights. Truman's response was frosty. "Mrs. Roosevelt, I value your perspective. However, I am the president now and I must make decisions based on current circumstances, not on what President Roosevelt might have done in a different situation. I hope you can understand and support that." Eleanor understood the message. Her direct influence on White House policy ended that day. The most personally painful dismissal for Truman was probably Frances Perkins. She had been a pioneer, the first woman in the cabinet, serving as labor secretary from 1933 to 1945. She was competent, experienced, and genuinely dedicated to workers' rights. But she was also completely devoted to Roosevelt's memory and made no secret of her belief that Truman was inadequate to fill Roosevelt's shoes. In meetings, she would frequently say things like, "President Roosevelt's approach to this was," or, "I think President Roosevelt would want us to." Truman endured this for about 6 weeks before summoning Perkins to the Oval Office in early June. He told her directly, "Frances, I appreciate your service to this country, but I need a labor secretary who is focused on my administration's priorities, not on preserving President Roosevelt's legacy. I think it's time for you to step down." Perkins was devastated but had no choice. She submitted her resignation immediately. Years later, she wrote in her memoir that she believed Truman had been insecure and unable to handle being compared to Roosevelt. She was correct about the comparison bothering him, but wrong about why. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr.'s dismissal was even more dramatic. Morgenthau had been Roosevelt's close friend and trusted economic advisor. He had guided the country through the Depression and financed the war effort. He assumed he would continue as Treasury Secretary under Truman, but Truman had already decided Morgenthau had to go. In July 1945, Morgenthau requested a meeting with Truman to discuss post-war economic policy. Truman used the meeting to inform Morgenthau his services were no longer needed. Morgenthau was shocked and asked why. Truman's response was blunt. "Henry, you were Roosevelt's man. You're not my man. I need people around me who are loyal to me, who will implement my policies, not spend their time telling me what Roosevelt would have done. I appreciate your service, but it's time for you to move on." Morgenthau left the meeting stunned. He had expected to serve at least through the end of the war with Japan. Instead, he was out within weeks. The press portrayed it as Truman dismissing a highly competent economic expert out of spite. Truman didn't care. Attorney General Francis Biddle learned of his dismissal through a newspaper report before Truman had the courtesy to tell him personally. Truman had decided to replace Biddle with his friend Tom Clark from Texas. Rather than inform Biddle directly, Truman had someone leak it to the press. When Biddle came to Truman's office to confirm the report, Truman simply said, "Yes, it's true. I'm making changes. I'll need your resignation." Biddle asked if there was any specific problem with his performance. Truman's answer was revealing. "No, Francis, you've done fine work. But you were Roosevelt's Attorney General and I need mine." The pattern was clear. Competence didn't matter. Experience didn't matter. Expertise didn't matter. What mattered was whether someone had been close to Roosevelt. If the answer was yes, they were out. Truman was building an administration based on personal loyalty rather than merit, and he made no apologies for it. He had learned from Roosevelt's treatment of him that in politics, loyalty matters more than capability. So, he demanded absolute loyalty and showed no mercy to anyone who seemed to be living in Roosevelt's shadow rather than serving Truman's present. By September 1945, just 5 months after Roosevelt's death, Truman had replaced or marginalized virtually everyone in Roosevelt's inner circle. The cabinet was almost entirely new. The White House staff had been completely changed. Even career civil servants who had been close to Roosevelt found themselves reassigned to obscure posts or pressured to retire. It was a complete transformation of the executive branch, executed with ruthless efficiency. The purge had significant consequences for Truman's presidency. On one hand, it established his authority unambiguously. No one could question who was in charge or whether Truman was just a caretaker preserving Roosevelt's legacy. Truman was his own man, for better or worse. On the other hand, the loss of institutional knowledge and experience hurt the administration. Truman's new team made mistakes that experienced Roosevelt personnel would have avoided. Foreign policy in particular suffered from the loss of people who understood the complex relationships Roosevelt had built with Churchill and Stalin. But Truman never regretted the purge. In later years, when asked about why he had dismissed so many Roosevelt people so quickly, his answer was consistent. I couldn't trust them. They were loyal to a dead man, not to me. They thought I was inadequate and tried to manipulate me. So I got rid of them. Simple as that. You can't govern if your own staff is working against you. It was a harsh assessment, but not entirely unfair. Many Roosevelt loyalists did view Truman as inadequate and did try to preserve Roosevelt's policies regardless of what Truman wanted. The most revealing comment about the purge came from Truman's personal diary discovered after his death. In an entry from June 1945, he wrote, "Dismissed 3 more Roosevelt people today. They looked shocked, as if they believed they were entitled to remain indefinitely simply because Roosevelt had favored them. They don't comprehend that this is my administration now. Roosevelt left me nothing but problems and people who think I'm not capable enough to solve them. Well, I'm solving them my way, and I'm doing it without people who spend all their time telling me how superior Roosevelt was. If I wanted Roosevelt's policies, I'd have kept Roosevelt's people. I don't, so I won't." That diary entry captures the essence of why Truman dismissed everyone who worked closely with Roosevelt. It wasn't just about building his own team or establishing authority. It was about anger and resentment that Roosevelt had set him up to fail, and that Roosevelt's people seemed to be hoping for that failure. Truman couldn't succeed as president while surrounded by people who constantly reminded him he wasn't Roosevelt. So he removed them, all of them, and rebuilt the White House from scratch with people who believed in Harry Truman. The purge of Roosevelt's staff was Truman's declaration of independence from his predecessor's shadow. It was brutal, it was personal, and it was probably necessary. Truman couldn't govern as Roosevelt's caretaker. He had to govern as his own man, and that meant removing everyone whose loyalty was to Roosevelt's memory rather than to Truman's presidency. History has judged the purge harshly in some respects, seeing it as vindictive and wasteful. But from Truman's perspective, it was survival. He had to dismantle Roosevelt's infrastructure to build his own. And he did exactly that without hesitation or regret.